Is the American Revolution the most important event in world history since the birth of Christ? Hey folks, I'm Todd Sturmer. I'm a historian of the American Revolution and resistance history at the University of Southern Denmark and Johns Hopkins, and the author of Resistance History of the United States. Ken Burns, in an interview with Salon, recently said this: "The American Revolution was the most significant event in world history since the birth of Christ." I'm not asking you to accept my interpretation of what that means. I'm asking you to sit with the claim itself and think through what it requires you to believe, not just about the American Revolution, but about how history works, whose story matters, and whose framework you're using to make sense of the past. Now, Burns' American Revolution is launching now in PBS, and it's getting the kind of attention his work always gets: respectful reviews, classroom adoption, the assumption that this is how we should understand our history because he's America's storyteller. But before it becomes the definitive popular narrative, the way his Civil War series ruined people's understanding of that event did, it's worth asking some questions about what his approach actually does. Because this is not new. This is the same framework Burns has used for decades. The Civil War, the national parks, jazz, Vietnam, World War II. Every series centers American nationhood as the organizing principle. The past gets shaped, flattened, and forced into his narrative about what we supposedly share as Americans. But that we isn't neutral. It's not an invitation to complexity. It's a very particular understanding of what America is and should be: liberal, constitutional, exceptional, redemptive. The nation makes mistakes, but it corrects them. It falls short of its ideals, but it bends toward justice. The framework is always: the founding established something unprecedented, and American history is the story of gradually realizing those founding principles. So here's the question I think you should ask as you approach Burns' American Revolution or any of his work. 1. If you believe the American Revolution was the most significant event in world history since the birth of Christ, what's that actually mean? What happened in those, 1800 years that mattered less? The fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. What are you saying about the rest of human experience when you make that claim? What kind of historian are you? What does it mean that the timeline runs from Christ to America, and that these are your two coordinates for understanding history? Even after a career of doing it, you can make that claim. 2. Whose history becomes peripheral or irrelevant in that framing? If the American founding is the pivot point of modern history, what happens to Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Islamic world? What happens to indigenous peoples except as obstacles to the nation's expansion, a big point of his national parks series? What happens to the enslaved except as a problem the nation had to overcome? Does everyone else's history only matter insofar as it relates to America's story and his framing within that? 3. What worldview does this framing assume? Is this a secular claim about political significance, or is there a theological element to it? Does it require you to see Western Christianity as the universal framework for human history? Does it make American nationhood the culmination of some larger purpose? Democratic inevitability, the fulfillment of Enlightenment ideals, the political expression, maybe even of a divine order? 4. What does it mean that this framing appears in liberal nationalism, not just conservative evangelical nationalism? Burns isn't a Christian nationalist. He's a liberal institutionalist. He believes in pluralism, democratic norms, constitutional government, and yet his story still centers Christianity and American exceptionalism as the twin poles of world history. What does that tell you about what liberal nationalism requires to sustain itself? What does it need the founding to be in order to justify a kind of constitutional worship? 5. How does this framework determine what counts as legitimate political action? This is especially important for resistance history. If the American Revolution is somehow a model for legitimate change, flattened, what happens to resistance movements that reject and have rejected that model? What happens to the abolitionists who said the Constitution itself was the problem, no union with slaveholders? Or to labor organizers who challenged property rights and early world as anarchists, to civil rights activists who insisted on immediate action rather than gradualism? Are they just extremists, outside agitators, threats to the constitutional order, precisely because they won't accept the founding as the boundary of legitimate resistance? And I guess last, what does Burns' approach do to complexity? His work is exhaustively researched, beautifully produced, emotionally powerful. But does it invite genuine complexity about the past? Or does it force everything into a narrative of shared national identity? Does it let the past be strange, contingent, contested? Or does it smooth contradictions into a story about American becoming? Can you have a revolution led by enslavers that's the most significant event since Christ without flattening what that actually means? And then I guess that leads you maybe to an additional question. What is Burns asking you to believe about the founding? Is 1776 an event in history? Contested, contingent, the product of specific circumstances and interests, or is it a sacred origin? The moment when something unprecedented and universal came into being? Is the Constitution a political compromise that protected slavery by design, or is it a breakthrough document that established enduring principles? Your answer determines whether the resistance to the constitutional order is legitimate or heretical. So, how does this framing shape what happens next? Burns' series will become the narrative millions of people use to understand the revolution. It'll show up in classrooms and political speeches, maybe even in Supreme Court opinions citing the founders' intent. It'll reinforce or challenge how we think about protest, institutional authority, the limits of legitimate political action. So what does it mean if the framework is already locked in? If the revolution must be exceptional, the founding must be redemptive, the nation must be the center of its own story? Again, I'm not telling you what to think about Burns' work. I'm asking you to approach it with these questions in mind, to think about what his framework assumes, what it erases, what it requires you to accept about American nationhood and its place in history. Because this isn't just about one documentary series. It's about how nationalist historiography works, how it makes the nation's origins sacred, how it determines what counts as legitimate history and legitimate resistance, how it treats dissent from the founding narrative not as intellectual disagreement, but as a threat to its shared identity. Take a look at my comment sections one of these days. You can watch Burns' American Revolution and find it moving, informative, beautifully crafted. You can appreciate the research and the storytelling, but you can also ask what work that story is doing, what worldview it assumes, what it needs you to believe about America's place in history, and what it makes impossible to see or say. And those questions don't have easy answers. That's the point. That's kind of why I do what I do. But I do want you to sit with them, see where they lead. Decide for yourself what it means to claim that 13 colonies breaking from Great Britain was more significant than anything else that happened in 1,800 years of human history. And then ask yourself, whose history is that? What does it serve? What does it make you believe about the world? And then come back here and let me know what you think.